The Young and the Restless spoilers shock. A battle of titans, the fateful showdown between Victor Newman and Ian Ward. It was a moment that no one in Genoa City could ignore. A confrontation years in the making had finally reached its climax. Victor Newman, the legendary business tycoon, and Ian Ward, the manipulative and ruthless cult leader, had clashed many times before. But this time, it wasn't just about power, deception, or revenge. It was a battle for survival. The tension had been brewing for weeks. Ian had pushed too far, crossing lines that even the cold and calculating Victor could not ignore. The stakes had never been higher, and in a shocking turn of events, the battle ended not with words, but with bullets. The gunfire that shook Genoa City. Victor Newman had always been a man who calculated every move with precision. But on this fateful day, something inside him snapped. The years of threats, mind games, and personal attacks from Ian Ward had finally pushed him past the point of no return. In a split second, Victor reached into his coat, pulling out a handgun with a sharp, deliberate motion. The air was thick with tension, the silence deafening. And then, a shot rang out. The bullet struck Ian Ward square in the abdomen, sending him staggering backward. A gasp of pain escaped his lips, but the man who had survived so much refused to go down so easily. With sheer force of will, Ian raised his own weapon, his face contorted in pain but his eyes still burning with defiance. He aimed at Victor, pulling the trigger with what little strength he had left. A second gunshot tore through the air. This time, Victor Newman fell, clutching his stomach as blood seeped through his tailored shirt. He collapsed onto the ground, his body writhing in pain. Two powerful men, now both wounded, lay motionless on the cold, hard floor. Chaos unfolds. Victor rushed to the hospital. Screams echoed through the halls as people rushed in, horrified at the sight before them. Security and emergency responders quickly stormed the scene. Victor, the man who had built an empire, was losing blood rapidly. His family and close associates scrambled to his side, their faces painted with terror and disbelief. "Somebody get a doctor," a voice shouted in desperation. Medics quickly arrived, working frantically to stabilize him. His pulse was weak, his breathing shallow, but he was still alive. Every second counted. As the paramedics loaded Victor onto a stretcher, his wife, Nikki Newman, clutched his hand, tears streaming down her face. "Hold on, Victor," she whispered. "You're not leaving me. Not like this." With sirens blaring, the ambulance sped toward the hospital, carrying the man who had defined Genoa City for decades. Ian Ward, left to die in the shadows. But while Victor was surrounded by loved ones, Ian Ward was left behind, alone. The man who had spent years manipulating, deceiving, and ruining lives now lay in a darkened corner, clutching his own bleeding stomach. The pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating loneliness that surrounded him. He let out a choked sob, his fingers trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. But no one rushed to his aid. No medics fought to save him. No one cried out his name in fear of losing him. The realization hit him harder than the bullet itself. "Why?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Why does no one care?" For the first time in his life, Ian Ward felt something far worse than pain, insignificance. As he lay there, the walls around him seemed to close in, suffocating him in the bitter truth. He was dying, and no one cared. The fight for Victor's life at Genoa City Memorial Hospital. Victor was rushed into emergency surgery. The doctors worked tirelessly, their hands moving with the skill and urgency required to save a life as valuable as his. Outside the operating room, his family waited in agony. Nikki, her hands shaking, prayed desperately for a miracle. Nick and Victoria, his children, paced anxiously, their minds filled with memories of their father, his strength, his wisdom, and his unyielding spirit. Adam, standing apart from the others, wrestled with his own emotions. Despite their complicated history, Victor was still his father. Time moved painfully slow, and every second felt like an eternity. And then, after what felt like a lifetime, a doctor finally emerged. The verdict: will Victor survive? The room fell silent as everyone held their breath, waiting for the doctor's words. His face was serious, his voice measured. "Victor made it through the surgery," he said, pausing briefly. "But his condition is still critical. The next 24 hours are crucial." A collective sigh of relief filled the air, but the tension wasn't gone. Victor wasn't out of danger yet. Nikki clasped her hands together, whispering a silent prayer. "Come back to us, Victor," she murmured. "We need you." Meanwhile, Ian Ward's fate sealed? Back at the scene of the shooting, the once mighty Ian Ward lay in the shadows, his breaths growing weaker. The irony was undeniable. The man who had always controlled the game now had no control at all. The darkness began to consume him, his mind slipping away. Was this it? Was this how his story ended? Would anyone even remember him? Would anyone care? His body shuddered, his vision blurring. And then... silence. The aftermath, what happens next? Victor's recovery would be slow, but one thing was certain, he was still alive, and his story was far from over. But Ian Ward? His fate remained uncertain. Would someone find him in time, or had he taken his last breath? One thing was clear, Genoa City would never be the same after this day. The battle between Victor Newman and Ian Ward had ended, but its consequences were just beginning. Justice, survival, and the aftermath of the Victor Ian Ward shootout. The dramatic showdown between Victor Newman and Ian Ward had left both men critically wounded. While Victor was immediately rushed to the hospital, Ian Ward was left behind, bleeding out in solitude, a fitting irony for a man who had spent his life manipulating others, only to be abandoned in his most desperate hour. But the law doesn't ignore even its most despised criminals. Chance Chancellor steps in, Law versus Morality. As the chaos settled, Chance Chancellor, one of Genoa City's most dedicated law enforcers, arrived at the scene. As a detective and a man of principle, he couldn't afford to let personal feelings dictate his duty. Despite Ian Ward's horrific past, the law dictated that he deserved medical attention and a fair trial. Approaching the barely conscious Ian, Chance observed the blood pooling beneath him, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. His eyes fluttered open, pain and confusion clouding them. Chance's jaw tightened. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only professional obligation. "You're under arrest, Ian," Chance stated firmly, cuffing him despite his weakened state. "You're not dying on my watch, not before you pay for everything you've done." Paramedics arrived shortly after, lifting Ian onto a stretcher. Unlike Victor, who was surrounded by family, Ian was accompanied only by law enforcement and the weight of his own sins. His road to recovery wouldn't lead to freedom, it would lead straight to a prison cell. Victor's fight for life, a family in turmoil. Meanwhile, at Genoa City Memorial Hospital, Victor's condition remained dire. Despite the doctor's best efforts, the blood loss was extensive, and his body was struggling to fight back. Machines beeped in steady, unnerving rhythms, monitoring his fragile vitals. Outside the operating room, his family stood in silent agony. Nikki Newman, his devoted wife, was inconsolable. Her normally poised demeanor had crumbled. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched a rosary, whispering desperate prayers. She had been through so much with Victor, but this moment of helplessness was unbearable. Nick and Victoria, his children, hovered nearby, grim determination on their faces. They had fought with their father, resented him at times, but losing him? It wasn't an option. Adam, Victor's most conflicted son, kept his distance. His emotions were unreadable, but beneath the surface, turmoil brewed. Could he truly hate a man who had given him life? Doctors worked tirelessly, performing multiple blood transfusions, attempting to repair the internal damage caused by Ian's bullet. But Victor Newman had never been an ordinary man. His strength, his resilience, had always set him apart. Now, those same qualities had to carry him through this battle for survival. Justice versus revenge, the ethics of the shootout. This wasn't just a personal feud, this was a case of justice, survival, and consequences. The Newman-Ward conflict had reached a boiling point, but its repercussions would ripple through Genoa City for a long time. The questions that lingered in everyone's minds: was Victor right to pull the trigger first? He had always believed in power and dominance, but did that justify his decision to shoot Ian? Or had he let personal vengeance cloud his judgment? Should Ian be saved at all? Many believed he deserved to die alone, to suffer as he had made others suffer. But chance upheld the law, ensuring Ian's survival so he could face real justice. Will Victor survive? His presence had shaped Genoa City for decades. If he survived, would he emerge stronger, or would this event change him permanently? This wasn't just about two men and a gunfight, it was about morality, justice, and the inescapable consequences of their actions. Final thoughts: a city on edge as Victor lay in critical condition, the world around him held its breath. Genoa City wasn't just waiting to see if he survived, it was waiting to see what would come next. Would Ian Ward finally be brought to justice? Would Victor Newman return, stronger than ever, or would this battle leave scars even he couldn't hide? And what would this mean for his family, his business, and the power dynamics in Genoa City? One thing was certain: this was far from over.